Richard Martin Lloyd Walters, aka Slick Rick, in case you didn't already know, is to most people the original storyteller in hip-hop. What does that mean? Melodic flows, a trademark eyepatch, a British accent, and fun narratives in the 1980s and onwards. He's worked with almost every big name in the golden era of hip-hop, and for good reason, and I'll be covering his work very lightly here. I'll definitely do a separate video for his 4 albums at some point in the future. He was born on the outskirts of London in the town of Mitcham in Surrey, and his family immigrated to the Bronx at the age of 11 in 1976. When he was 18 months old, he was blinded in one eye due to an incident with broken glass from a window, and that's where the signature eye patch or sunglasses look came from. As a young teen in New York, he was inspired by the novel rap group, the Cold Crush Brothers, who would hold block parties for free. When attending the High School of Music and Art in Harlem, he formed a posse called the Kangle Crew. He'd later go on to join Doug E. Fresh's Get Fresh crew under the name MC Ricky D, and feature on prominent tracks like La Dee Da Dee, which would go on to become one of the most sampled records in history. Eventually, also the track that garnered Rick the attention of budding music mogul Leo Cohen, who was rising through the ranks in Def Jam Records at the time. Around 1986-1987, he left the Get Fresh crew for a solo contract with Def Jam. This was where he had to make a whole album, all the cuts, and he had to make sure that the tracks for this project would sell himself. To be honest, he admits it was all a learning experience for him back then. The winter of 1988 would be ushered in by the release of Rick's solo debut, The Great Adventures of Slick Rick, a project that went on to be number 1 on the Billboard's R&B hip-hop chart. Rick's amazing storytelling abilities, something not predominantly seen in mainstream hip-hop during the late 1980s, was what stood out here. Children's Story, as an example, was a powerful song, a tale about a troubled kid who goes out of control on robbing people, who then gets in a confrontation with a police officer, and then the police officer decides to shoot him, despite the kid dropping his gun. There's a lot more to this, including hostages, a getaway, and confrontations, but the overall lessons make it an eerily relatable song over 30 years later for many black Americans to this day. Mona Lisa was another track, which was a great example in simplicity, a tale of how he met a young woman in a pizza parlor, who he then tries to seduce in vain, as the conversation becomes a fight of egos on both sides. This was an example of how stereotyping could lead to unneeded arguments and how flaws in everyone are often hidden. In the early 1990s, he was charged with and later convicted of attempted murder after he shot at his former bodyguard cousin, Mark Plummer, who Rick claimed tried to rob him and had harassed his mother with death threats. While awaiting sentencing, Rick hastily recorded 21 songs for follow-up albums. Later that year, Rick headed to prison in upstate New York to begin a 6-year jail term. During periods on bail, he rush-released The Ruler's Back in 1991 and Behind Bars in 1994. He admits now that both of these records were simply to keep his name relevant and to pay the bills. The album sounded rushed, and Slick Rick's stories are not as articulated as they once were in his debut. He himself added that this was down to external producers adding beats to his vocals, and that also the rhymes were too fast, so people couldn't really get into the stories. Overall, he was unhappy with that stage in his life, where he was incarcerated, because he felt it basically caused his name to diminish. I Shouldn't Have Done It off The Ruler's Back was an upbeat track, and despite having fast rhymes and a repetitive beat, it told an interesting story about how jealousy caused a relationship that his alter ego had to break down, and that his sense of internal control and own reckless behavior kept becoming overbearing in the relationship. His own infidelity was something he came to regret, as she took her own life due to an overdose. It's a sad story that's continually broken down by Rick over 3 verses. Blink and you'll miss parts of the story though. Once released from prison in 1997, he moved upstate to Bearsville, New York to record, which gave him some clarity in his head, away from the craziness and hubbub of the music industry. And there were definitely heavy hitters collaborated with on his next project. DJ Clark Kent, known for his production work with Jay-Z and the Notorious B.I.G., was one of the core collaborators, who also urged Rick to flex on his competition for this next album rather than to just tell stories. And then came 1999. He released The Art of Storytelling, a much more cohesive project with people like Big Boy, Nas, Raekwon and Snoop Dogg. This was his last ever album more than 20 years on, but reached number 8 on the Billboard 200 and number 1 on the top R&B and hip hop chart at the time. This was a return back to form. On Who Rottenham, for example, he speaks of a vaguely biblical story in the vein of the story of Joseph and the coat of many colours, with Rick playing the role of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh's personal rapper. The beat, produced by Bootcamp Click, affiliate Nod, is a highly complex track that's filled with guitars, strings and keyboards. The protagonist in this song doubles up as his own alter ego, where there is a display of pure lyricism and bragging throughout. People often note that the years in prison have clearly affected Rick, as this album was significantly less light-hearted than his previous works. The titles of the song give this point away quite clearly. Just look at the first few tracks: Jail Skit, Street Talking. The lyrical content complements these titles, as Slick Rick is much more street oriented and also relationship heavy on this album. While many see this as a welcome change of pace, I guess, some other people might find this extremely out of character for him, the humour being replaced by quite strong lessons in a lot of instances. Rick is definitely quite smooth on the art of storytelling, and that even when the verses are quite sparse, it's impossible to discern this from the more intricate bars, and that's what the art of storytelling is. It's doing tricks so well that no one really notices. As You Discover Music said, he hasn't let his incarceration issues define who he is, and he's had that ability to be relevant in hip-hop after nearly a decade-long absence. And despite a smaller body of work than most artists in general, he remains one of the most sampled, interpolated, and also quoted rappers of all time. I love the line from You Discover Music where they say, "He's been referenced so often, it's impossible to tell where the tribute ends and the inadvertent homage begins."